India is oscillating between severe heat waves and drought, heavy rain and floods. Climate change is now wreaking havoc in the world's second most populous nation.
Very high rainfall and therefore water coming into the rivers is increasing.
More than 1,000 people have lost their lives and tens of thousands have been rendered homeless.
It takes away livelihoods, takes away assets of people, destroys everything that has been built over years.
But are these seasonal phenomena becoming worse as the years go by? Can India mitigate the adverse impact of climate change without jeopardizing its economic growth objectives? And how long can the poor bear the brunt of the devastation caused by the extreme weather events? First, COVID. Then, an economic and humanitarian disaster that came about following a total and prolonged lockdown. And now, torrential rain and widespread floods. India, a country of 1.3 billion people, is facing dire challenges on multiple fronts. As it struggles to get a grip on the soaring COVID infection numbers, another calamity is staring the nation in the face. Heavy monsoon rain has caused rivers to overflow their banks, flooding millions of hectares of cropland and killing more than 1,000 people so far. Tens of thousands of villages are submerged, rendering millions homeless.
The flood situation in India is absolutely brutal. We've had floods in multiple states. Recently, even in Rajasthan, in the Jaisalmer district, for example, which is actually a desert, and which is a desert because it's not got flooded, and it doesn't have much rainfall. We've had floods in places like Telangana, we've had floods in Andhra, we've had floods in Maharashtra, Gujarat, of course in Assam and Bihar, as we always do. So even Odisha, even Madhya Pradesh. So it's really extraordinary how the deluge has come and swept over all of India and every single territory.
Even though it's a recurrent phenomenon in India, this year it has been much worse. It rains so much that there is an intense rainfall event which leads to sudden flooding.
Scientists believe that the worsening situation is linked to climate change and global warming. The flood situation is becoming worse every year due to intense rainfall that continues for days, overwhelming the water-carrying capacities of the rivers and drainage systems. The monsoon season in India normally stretches from June to September, when winds gather moisture from the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, and the Bay of Bengal and culminate in rain over land. From October to December, the winds reverse direction. But climate change has disrupted the seasonal cycle. There are now long spells of drought followed by scanty rainfall and then intense rain within a short period.
What we have seen now over the past few years is that it's not the floods, but the nature of flooding that is changing. And the nature of flooding that is changing is happening because you are seeing more extreme rainfall event. So you're getting massive rain falling in short durations, which is exacerbating the flooding. And that is why you're beginning to see newer areas coming under floods each year. And you are beginning to see the extent of, therefore, the flooding also increasing.
The impact of climate on India is now here. If you look over the past few years, the amount of rain over the year hasn't changed. But the number of days that it is rainy has dramatically declined. So when it rains, it pours and we have floods. And then you have many days without rain, so we have droughts. Now the same area has got both floods and droughts. Similarly, if you look at cyclones, the number of cyclones haven't changed, but the intensity of the cyclones has become much stronger than it was earlier. The short point is, climate change is here, and we are feeling its impacts on a daily basis.
Watching the changing weather patterns intensely is Anand Sharma, who keeps a close eye on the cloud formations and wind directions all over the subcontinent on a daily basis. He is one of the country's top weathermen. Sharma admits that climate change adds to the problem of climate variability, leading to floods.
If we see past 100 years data, around 0.7 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures for the past 100 years. So there's a global warming, and scientists are linking that warming to climate change, that it will change the patterns, or there could be more intense rain in some areas, there could be droughts in other areas. And if there is intense rainfall, especially in areas which are prone to flooding, there could be increase in flooding. So climate change is an added pressure.
The impact of the vagaries of nature is devastating. From the northeastern state of Assam in the Himalayas, to the populous state of Bihar in the plains, to the vibrant city of Mumbai on the western coast, climate change is clearly evident all across the nation. Though extreme weather events have an impact on the whole country, it is the poor and marginalized who suffer the most from frequent natural disasters. Their houses and farmland are submerged, wiping out their meager incomes and pushing them to the brink of starvation and death. Apart from the economic costs, the human costs are incalculable. A recent study suggests that every year, around 5,600 people die from extreme weather events in India. But experts think this number could be an underestimation, since deaths from droughts are not included. "49-year-old Reena Mudoy is facing extreme hardships following devastating floods in the Barbeta district of Assam this year. Reena ekes out a living making pots and plates from clay to support her ailing husband and 2 daughters.
সিতানে পানীটো বাঢ়ি সিতানে তলেও পানী ওপৰেও পানী থবা আমাৰ মাটিৰ বাচন আছে মাটিৰ বাচন থবাৰ হয় জাগা নাই বিছনাৰ ওপৰত মই ইটা পাছু পাতি বেলে বিছনাৰ ওপৰত থৈ কিনে মাটিৰ বাচন বিছনাৰ ওপৰত তুলি থৈ দিছো এখন বিছনা খালি কৰি কিনে ইমকে বাৰান্দাত একাঠু পানী হৈছে ঘৰত থুৰকিলটো হাসিন গলি যাব মোৰ এই বিছনাৰ ওপৰত মই তুলি থৈ দিছো বহুত গেছি ইটা ধান ইটা ভানিছিল বহুত গেছি নষ্ট হৈ যিগিটা কাৰা সৰু আছিল বাছান সেইখিনি মই বিছনাৰ ওপৰত তুলি থৈ দিছো সেইখিনি ভালেই আছে
Mudoy and her family spent the night awake, praying for the deluge to stop. But the rain kept falling and the water kept rising.
ৰাতিটো হেনেকৈ আছে আৰু পানী বাঢ়ি আছে অলপকৈ বৰষুণ আহি আছে ইমকৈ চিন্তা কৰি টোপনিও নাই ঘুমতি নাই পানী যদি বেছি হয় ঘৰ পানী দি সুৰকে কি বিলে হ'ব আমাৰ ক'ত থাকিম ইমকৈ ৰাস্তা দি যাব নোৱাৰো পানীত ধৰি একাকাল পানী কেনেকৈ যাম সেইটোৱে ভাবি ভাবি থাকে ৰাতি পহৰ হ'ল টোপনি নাহিল
After daybreak, the rain relented for a while. But the whole village was already submerged by the Nakanda River, which was in spate. Making a living from earthen pottery is an extremely difficult task, even in the best of times. But doing so amid heavy rain and floods is an impossible proposition.
ইটা আছিল 40টা ইটা আছিল ধান আছিল সেয়া সব গলি গেছি বাহিৰৰ বিছনাতল জাপি থৈছিলো গলি গেছি আৰু ঘৰটো বৰষুণ পৰে পাকঘৰটো তাতে বানাও মাটিটো খুনাতে বহুত কষ্ট আছে মাটিটো খুনাতে এক টপা মাটি খুনলে 1 ঘণ্টাৰ ওপৰ লাগে হয় খুলি হয় সাজটোত খুন্দা লাগি ভাঙি যায় অলপ খুন্দা লাগিলে সাজটো ফাটি গেল এইটো তাৰমানে একদম নৰম কৰি ৰাখিব লাগে মাটিৰ বাচন পুলি ইমান এটা ভয় নাই কেঁচাটো বিৰাট ভয় সৰু চলি চটকে দিয়ে যেতিয়া ভাঙি গেল সেইটো ফাটি গেল কাম নাই সেইটো আৰু নতুনকৈ ধুনীয়া মাটিৰ লগত মাৰিব লাগিব
India specifically faces huge losses due to flood. You know, worldwide, the 10% loss due to floods globally happens in India. And as far as flood disaster is concerned, it is the most economic loss causing disaster to the tune of more than 50% losses is due to floods. And it is such a recurrent phenomena and for centuries it is happening, but there isn't much cure in sight. What we see is still that the poor people, they are affected the most. They are the ones who lose their lives, they lose their livelihoods.
Rebuilding lives from scratch is a Herculean task for the poor. There's no immediate end to their misery, since scientists believe extreme weather patterns are becoming more frequent due to climate change. Many states are vulnerable since major rivers flow through them. According to the National Disaster Management Authority, more than 40 million hectares, or 12% of India's total geographical area, are prone to floods. More than 1 million people have so far been evacuated in 11 states. At least 180,000 houses have been fully or partially damaged. How long will the poor face the vagaries of nature? What can be done to help relieve their pain and suffering? The northeastern state of Assam is known for its natural beauty and the famous Assam tea. Located along the Brahmaputra and the Barak river valleys in the Himalayas, it's also a region known to endure some of the highest rainfall in the world. With the warm, moist winds from the Bay of Bengal converging on a narrow zone along the mountains, the rainfall and flood situation in the state is showing no signs of improving over the years. This year has been no exception, with thousands of villages flooded and tens and thousands of villagers rendered homeless. Around 140 people have so far died in the floods in the state, with more than 56,000 homes partially or completely damaged. More than 265,000 hectares of cropland have been submerged, destroying the means of livelihood of tens of thousands of farmers. 55-year-old farmer Kalilu Raman couldn't save his crops as the swirling waters of the Brahmaputra river submerged his village in June and July.
আবার হে আইতে আমরা হে যে আবার বাঁশ খুঁটাই না কুবা করে এই যে ইটি করে না খাম গাইরে আবার হে যে হে মাছি বসা আবার আইতে না ধান তুললাম তুলে হে ধান আবার মাছি বানা হে মাছের তুললাম বুঝছেন কষ্ট খুব করছি যা কষ্ট করছি না ওরকম কষ্ট করে থাকি না তো এবার না এ চড়ছি চাং টাং ফালাইছি সব আবার এই যে পাল্লারি সব এনে না তুলে আবার নামান নেছি নামাইটা আমার চাং টাং ফালে আবার না এই যে চাঙের উপরে তোলা হয়েছে এবার খুব কষ্ট করছি তো এবারকার সন কষ্ট কোনো বছর হয় নাকি ধরেন 3 বার করে পানি আইছে আবার এই যে পানি আইছে তাতে এই যে কোনো রকম কমে না পানি কমবো নাকি আইতে তো পানি কমেই নাই আবার বাড়িতে উঠবো নাকি তা তো কয়া হইতেছে না আঙ্গরে তো গরু বাছুর বাঁচানো এই কষ্ট
Farmers like Raman have learned to live with the usual vagaries of nature. They know what to do when the rains begin, moving their cattle to higher ground or building higher platforms. But this year's rain and the flood were different. There was no warning as the rain poured and the floods engulfed his village.
হ্যাঁ এবার পানি আসে দিশা পাইনি তো এবার এই ধান কাটতে দিবে নাই এই যে ক্ষেত খোলা দেখলেন একবারে বালু ফুরে গেছে গা পাটগুলো মরে গেছে গা এবার মোটামুটি এবার পানির কথা কয় জানা এই পানি কমে আবার বাড়ে বৃষ্টি তো এবার কিরম পড়ছে কয়টা জানা এইখানি ওই উঠে আবার বৃষ্টি নামে তো এবারকার অবস্থা খুব খারাপই ধরে
The floods dealt a double blow during the COVID pandemic. Firstly, Raman's crops were destroyed in the floods. And he can't even sell whatever he has, such as cattle, to make a living, since there are no customers.
লকডাউনের জন্য তো এটা ধরেন একটু বস্তু আড়ে নিলিভারের দাম পাই না ইমরা কিনা লালা নাই বেশি না গ্রাহক নাই নেই না মানুষ নাই এটা থেকে অসুবিধা খুব অসুবিধা ধরেন একটা তেল ফুরাইলি তেল না পাওয়া যায় না কি মরিচ ফুলাইলো কি ঝালা ফুরাইলো না পাই না নুন গুনা পাওয়া যায় না কত সময় এই যাবত দোকানে ওপার জামু আঙ্গুরে তো মোটামুটি ধরেন এবার খুব কষ্ট নে ধরেন একটু নাও নিয়ে গেলাম এই নদী হানি যাতে 100 টাকা 200 টাকা চায় বেচা কিনি করবার উপায় না যাই আছে তাও বেচা কিনি করা যায় না এই গরু বাছুর কিনা ঘাস দেয় না বেচমু তা তো বাজারে নিলি না গায়ক নাই নেবো খেরা এইরকম অবস্থা হয়েছে আঙ্গুরে কষ্টরই নেই তো মোটামুটি ধরেন খুব কষ্ট হয়েছে আঙ্গুরে
Raman was hoping that the government would step in to alleviate the suffering. But the government provided some food grain that was not enough.
ইলিপ দিয়েছিল 3 বার দিয়েছিল বুঝি চাল দিয়েছিল চাল 4টা ডাল লবণ এই দিয়েছিল না ক্ষয়ক্ষতি তো দেয়ই নাই ক্ষয়ক্ষতি কোন থেকে দেবো ক্ষয়ক্ষতি দিবার গেলে তো বহুত দেয়া লাগবো আঙুর ক্ষয়ক্ষতি তো দেয় নাই আঙুরে 3 অক্টোর চাল দিয়েছিল আমরা এই 3 অক্টোর চাল খাওয়া দা 3 বার করে চাল দিল আর 4টা ডাল দিয়েছিল এই তাছাড়া আঙুরে আর এই ক্ষেত খেলা ক্ষতির কোনো তৈরি নেই তো সরকারে
Unlike Assam in the Himalayas, the eastern state of Bihar is in the Gangetic plains. But it's also ravaged by floods every year, since several major rivers flow through the state, including the Ganges, the Kosi, and the Bagmati. Being one of the most populous states with more than 100 million people, Bihar finds itself mostly at sea when the mighty rivers breach their embankments during the monsoon. More than 8.5 million people have been affected in the state this year, with around 1,000 villages reeling from the consequences of heavy rain. 32-year-old porter Abdul Wahab received a frantic call from his wife as water levels in his village in Samastipur district began to rise. Abdul was then far away in Gorakhpur, but he knew he had to somehow reach home to save his family.
और जब ये समस्तीपुर उतरा तो वहाँ पर भी साधन नहीं था, पूरा पब्लिक भरा हुआ था, इधर से भी भाग के गए थे, पूरा आदमी पुल पे जख्म धख्त एकदम भरा हुआ था। अब जो है साहब हम वहाँ पे बहुत परेशान हुए, ऑटो भी नहीं मिल रहा था, गाड़ी घोड़ा भी नहीं मिल रहा था। मैं पूछा कि मेरे को जठमलपुर जाना है, बोला कि नहीं भैया गाड़ी उड़ी नहीं है, यहाँ से कोई साधन नहीं है। हम बोले कि पैदल कैसे जाएंगे।
Abdul reached his village around 8 in the evening. He saw water had already reached his doorsteps and was rising steadily.
एक बसते बसते रात जो है फिर भी घर में पानी घुस गया, और जब पानी घर में घुसा तो बच्चे लोग जो है अचानक वो डरने लगा, घबराने लगा। हमको पप्पा पप्पा कह रहा, हम बोला बेटा आराम से रहो, बच्चिया आराम से रहो, तुम टेंशन नहीं लो, हम आ गए हैं, हम ऊंचा जगह में लेके चलेंगे। फिर जो है वो जो है बच्चे लोग को फिर ऊंचा जगह में जो है किसी का छत पे ले जाके हम रखे उसको। फिर जो है जब आए आपस तो देख रहे हैं कि कोठी के अंदर जो है पानी घुस गया, दाना मेरा पूरा डूब गया। अब क्या करें हम, परेशानी की हालत में। एक जो खाना जो बना के शाम को तो खाए थे, रात का मामला जो है बहुत गंभीर आ गया। अब वो खाना बनाने का सिस्टम हम बचाए कि बाल बच्चे को बचाए, पहले बाल बच्चे को बचाए हम साहब, उसके बाद ऊंचे पर ले जाके फिर दोबारा घर में आए तो देख रहे हैं कि पूरा कोठी का दाना ऊना सब भीग गया। हमारा जो घर में जो 2-4 गो इधर उधर कपड़ा लत्ता था सब फंस गया। वो रात के मौसम में हम लोग बिल्कुल सोए नहीं, यही ख्वाबों में ख्यालों में सोच रहे थे कि कहीं मेरी मौत आ जाएगी तो बाल बच्चे को कौन देखेगा, बाल बच्चे का मौत आ जाएगा तो हमें कौन देखेगा। डर के मारे एकदम रात भर कांपते रहे साहब। वो ठंडी हवा और ऊपर से बारिश और ऊपर में छत पे जो बैठे तो वहाँ भी कोई साधन नहीं साहब। वो पानी जो है टप 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 पानी देह पर बच्चे के गिर रहा है। अपने बच्चे को पेटकुनियाँ लगा के सुला दिए, उसके ऊपर हम सो गए। पानी गिरे कोई बात नहीं, बच्चा तो बचेगा। इतनी परेशानी साहब, डर के मारे हालत खराब।
The rising water level was not the only danger that Abdul and his family faced. The water brought in snakes and leeches that threatened their lives.
सबके घर में पानी आया, रात का मौसम था, सांप कीड़ा बिच्छू क्या बोलते हैं वो जो वो बड़ा बड़ा जोंक होता है, आदमी लोग को बच्चे लोग को सबको पकड़ा। वो रात में चिल्ला रहा, हार्ट अटैक हो जाता साहब। ऐसे में तो मेरा बच्चा और गांव का आदमी मर जाता।
The small plot where Abdul had planted rice samplings was submerged as well.
तो 2-4 गो लगाए हुए थे धान, वो सारा डूब गया।
In Bihar, farmers have lost their crops completely. They've lost their land completely. And what makes it really complex is that no longer is the Kosi depositing silt in their farms. It's actually putting in sand, which means that the land is getting less and less fertile. So they've lost not only crop but also fertility. Hundreds and thousands of homes have been lost. Livestock has been lost, and we're looking at some smaller numbers of deaths, but overall massive entry of these people who are flood affected back into poverty.
See, Bihar floods, even many more people get affected. This year also 85 lakh people have got affected there. Though the life lost as compared to Assam has been less, it's 27, but the disruptions are massive. And the worst part is it's showing an increasing trend. Because for the last few years, it has been a yearly feature. Every year it is happening, and there is no end in sight, no respite is seen. And as the state government's efforts in being, making embankments and all, they are sometimes even proving counterproductive. In terms of they're prolonging the floods. The flood waters are not even receding because of the embankments and all.
The scale of the humanitarian crisis is so huge that both the state and federal governments are at their wits' end. They're also completely overstretched amid a raging pandemic.
In both states, I'm sure governments are doing what they can. Governments today are completely overworked, overstretched, fatigued. We have to understand that this crisis, as I said, has come on top of that other, pandemic that they are already dealing with. And it's the same civil public services that are being called out, whether it's called out for the pandemic or for floods. But I'm sure governments will do what they can. But the larger question that we have to ask is, do we have the right strategy that governments can employ so that next year the flood is not so bad? Otherwise, we're on a constant firefighting effort. And this year, the firefighting of floods is even worse because we have COVID to deal with at the same time.
There's no doubt that the states are working very hard. They've set up these, these relief camps. In Bihar, they're giving out meals. Bihar has been flooded for decades, but the reason we don't have these kinds of deaths is because we have a whole process to reduce that. That doesn't reduce miseries overall. It reduces loss of life. People still lose everything they have, on an annual basis. But they have made all these efforts. But, all these efforts are really about mitigating something that could be reduced in impact and could have perhaps even with long-term governance and with a focus on the root causes, it could have even been dramatically reduced.
It's not just the villagers that are bearing the brunt of climate change and natural disasters. India's financial capital, Mumbai, home to 20 million people, is now facing massive flooding every year. Will large parts of Mumbai go underwater in a few decades, as some scientists have predicted? Mumbai, India's commercial capital, a vibrant, densely populated city of 20 million. Mumbai has borne the brunt of massive flooding caused by relentless storms and heavy downpours. The rainfall is said to be the heaviest since 2005 and reached new areas which had never experienced it before. According to a recent study, Mumbai is at risk of being submerged by 2050. The study predicts that climate change has contributed to rising sea levels, and coastal flooding will likely be far greater than ever before. For people in Mumbai, the gloomy prediction comes as no surprise, since they are already paying a heavy price with severe flooding every year.
There is absolutely no doubt that Mumbai is a victim of climate change. I wish it were only climate change, and I wish we knew what to do to make sure that the worst impacts of climate change and flooding could be avoided.
Originally built on a series of islands, the city has always struggled to accommodate millions of people who are drawn by its industries, trading hubs, and its port. Unplanned and unchecked growth that followed has led to the destruction of wetlands and mangroves that once acted as a natural barrier against nature's extreme events.
Mumbai, a city that lives right on the coast, and we've had our fair share of floods. From 2005 July onward, we've been having floods every year, sometimes more, sometimes less. But the reasons for this are not very difficult to ascertain. We filled up our wetlands. We have destroyed almost all our natural drainages. And at this moment in time, we have built up to the extent where the flood waters and the storm drains that used to allow water to exit, those storm drains are choked with plastic garbage.
If you look at cities like Mumbai and Chennai, which are on the coast, we have the additional problem of high tides. And if there is a strong rainfall event, which occurs at the same time as the high tide, then the water has nowhere to go, it just stands there. So urbanization, population, growth in areas which were floodplains, and high rainfall and high tides together lead to the kind of problems that we have in Mumbai.
Climate change is the root cause. But then you have a drainage system, you have 2,000 drains above ground and some 400 underground, and these haven't been desilted, these haven't been modernized as the city has increased. You've also had a huge amount of deforestation, again in Bombay, I'm talking of Bombay precisely as an example. I mean, the RA forest is an iconic example of how the metro just cut off 2,000 trees. On top of that, the mangroves are just being 15% or so have anyway been lost, although that number is contested. But you're cutting off further things because of the Navi Mumbai airport, the Navi Mumbai airport, and other kinds of infrastructure. So basically, the only natural barriers you have to protect you, you are doing away with them. So we're talking of a combination of climate change and extraordinarily poor planning and extraordinarily poor urban, planning that kind of makes these, freak events much, much more severe.
Restaurant owner Rakesh Gupta is a witness to the city's unplanned growth over the years. 64-year-old Gupta's restaurant has been closed for months following the lockdown. But he faced double jeopardy this year when his home in a low-lying area in the eastern suburb of Chembur turned into a virtual pond during heavy showers in August. Gupta knows he and his neighbors are paying a heavy price for the unplanned growth and destruction of the city's biodiversity.
नंबर ऑफ पॉपुलेशन बढ़ गई है यहाँ पे बॉम्बे के अंदर, आबादी बढ़ गई है, बिल्डिंग्सें बढ़ गई हैं, टावर्स आ गए हैं, कॉलोनीज आ गई हैं, मगर उसके लिए इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर कहाँ पे क्रिएट किया गया है? जो स्ट्रॉन्ग वाटर ड्रेन्स है या रोड्स के लेवल है, तो म्यूनसिपैलिटी ने सब कुछ करना है.
When the heavy downpour started in July, Gupta and his family sat on their bed, keeping a close eye on the rising water level in the bedroom.
अभी ये जो हमारे यहाँ का प्रॉब्लम है, ये 10-15 साल से चला आ रहा है. तो हम लोग तो क्या है, बैठे बैठे इंतज़ार करते जब बरसात आती है कि ये देखने के लिए पानी कब घर में घुसेगा। अभी इस टाइम जब लास्ट में पानी आया था तो मैं मेरे बेड पे सोया था, मेरी मिसेज हम दोनों बेड पे थे, तो हम ये देख रहे थे कि भाई कितना लेवल राइज हो रहा है और हमें कब घर छोड़ के बाहर निकलना है। मेरी मिसेज तो उनकी सहेली रहती है बाजू वाली बिल्डिंग में, वहाँ चली जाती हैं। मैं, मेरी गाड़ी है, मैं गाड़ी में जाके बैठ जाता हूँ बाहर। मेरे 2 बच्चे और ये है बहू जो है वो अपने मायके चली जाती हैं, मुलुंड में रहती हैं वो। और मेरे जो दोनों लड़के हैं वो या तो उनके बड़ा भाई रहता है यहाँ गंगा विहार में, वहाँ जाके रह लेते हैं। फिर ऐसा हालत है।
Unlike Rakesh Gupta, fisherman Nitesh Chandrakant Patil can't leave his home when the rain and high tides come, and they happen quite often when the fishing village is flooded. 35-year-old Patil and other fishermen depend on the sea as their main source of income. They go out to fish, mostly along the coastline at the break of dawn, and come back around noon. They again go out to fish in the late afternoon. But the regular flooding in the village has disrupted their lives and livelihoods.
आम्ही म्हणजे मच्छीमार आम्ही कुठे जाऊ शकत नाही, कारण आमचा पूर्ण जे काय व्यवसाय हा पूर्ण धंदा हा आमच्या इकडे म्हणजे जास्त एरियामध्येच आहे सर्व. कारण आमचं घर इथेच आहे, बोटी आमच्या इथेच आहे, म्हणून आम्हाला कुठेही बाहेर जाऊ शकत नाही आम्ही त्या सोडून. कारण आमचं जे धंदा आहे हा आम्हाला जीवा की प्राण आहे, त्यामुळे आम्ही बाहेर जाऊ शकत नाही.
The plight of those living near the sea has been highlighted in a new study that says almost 3 million people living within a kilometre from the city's coastline are under severe threat from flooding, storm surges and rise in sea levels. The study also predicts multiple hazards hitting the city's coast in the coming years with increasing intensity due to climate change. The yearly flooding has made the sinking city scenario all the more real. The city continues to grow at a frantic pace at the cost of its environment. Experts believe that large parts of Mumbai will be submerged in future if immediate steps are not taken to protect its environment and restore its biodiversity.
It'll go underwater because the water has no place else to escape, and it does not get filled into the aquifers the way it should. Our wetlands are being so rapidly reclaimed to put up tall buildings. We are blocking all the drainages. So as far as Mumbai is concerned, at one level we have the Greenland ice shelf that's going to be melting, the Arctic is melting, our glaciers are melting, the water is going into the sea levels will rise, and Mumbai is facing a situation where without rain, just at high tide, we're beginning to see coastal flooding. Now, I shudder to think what will happen if we have a sea surge and a cyclone at the same time. The last cyclone hit us, it was at low tide. If it was at high tide, we probably might have lost 200, 400, 500 lives, I don't know. But we are mismanaging our drainages, we are mismanaging the forests and the system that actually refills our aquifers, and we're completely making sure that the wetlands into which all the water would gather are now flatlands. We're making a swimming pool for ourselves, and we are going to get to see much worse flooding in the coming years.
त्याची चिन्ह आता जवळपास दिसायला लागलेली आहेत, कारण जे आमचे माझे वडिलांचे वडील आहेत ते ज्या पद्धतीने आम्हाला सांगतात की पहिला काय परिस्थिती होती आणि आता कशी परिस्थिती हळूहळू बदलत चाललेली आहे. कशी इथे पाणी तुमचं पूर्ण ओपनली होतं, काहीच पाणी कुठेच नाही राहायचं ते सांगतात आम्हाला. आणि आताची परिस्थिती काय झालेली आहे, लोकसंख्या वाढ झालेली आहे. कोस्टल रोडला आता भराव मोठ्या प्रमाणात टाकलेला, जवळपास अमरसन गार्डन, प्रियदर्शनी पार्क, महालक्ष्मी तिथे तर किनारपट्टीपासून जवळपास 500 मीटर पाण्यामध्ये भराव टाकला. डेअरीपासून जवळपास बघायला गेलो तर इथे तो जवळपास 200 मीटर पाण्यामध्ये गेलेले आहेत. किनारपट्टीपासून चौपाटीपासून 200 मीटर एवढा जर भराव तुम्ही जर समुद्रात टाकत गेले तर तो कुठेतरी बाहेर निघणार. जे किनारपट्टीचे गावं आहेत त्यांना तो डॅमेज करणारच.
Despite the looming disaster, experts believe that the government on its own cannot restore the balance between nature and development. They argue the task should be shared by both the government and the citizens to save the city from going underwater.
I don't think that decision makers have fully comprehended what the impact of climate change, rising seas, cyclones could be. Mumbai doesn't have a disaster plan, And apart from that, I really do feel that the citizens are equally to blame because we are voting for people who are doing the wrong thing. And we need to be able to convey to those people who are politicians, bureaucrats, businessmen, that look, we want you to do the right thing for us on the long term.
Solutions won't happen overnight. Climate change is a global phenomenon, and unless all nations make a joint effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, our planet will continue to see extreme events, endangering the lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions across the world. India has committed itself to meeting the Paris Climate Accord targets and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But will these targets be enough for India to mitigate the impact of natural disasters in the country? Industrial revolution, population growth, rapid urbanization, and massive deforestation. Factors which have contributed to the Earth's rapidly changing global climate and extreme weather events. And the situation is expected to worsen if nothing is done to address it. India, one of the countries worst hit by the adverse effects of climate change, is also home to 1/3 of the world's 1.2 billion people who are living in poverty. As a developing nation, it needs to grow the economy because that's the only way to help the poor and vulnerable lift themselves up from their current state. And rapid industrialization is seen as a natural step for the nation to make that leap forward. It's not surprising then that India is now the world's third largest emitter of greenhouse gases after China and the US. And it now has to play its part in cutting down the nation's high carbon footprint while not jeopardizing its economic growth prospects.
We need to find out which are the sectors which are contributing more to greenhouse gases and thereby contributing to warming and change. So we need to identify those sectors and act and find out efficient and those technologies which has low carbon footprint.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has vowed that India will go above and beyond the 2015 Paris Accord on combating climate change. The accord aims to keep global temperature rise this century below 2 degrees Celsius and aims to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It also aims to limit the amount of greenhouse gas emissions to the same levels that trees, soil, and oceans can absorb naturally. As it ramps up the country's alternative energy sector, India installed 7.3 gigawatt of solar power last year, strengthening its position as the third largest solar market in the world. Can India meet the goals it has set for itself?
Very ambitious pledges at Paris. In fact, the Climate Transparency Group says that India is the only G20 country whose pledges are on track to take the world towards 2 degrees centigrade increase over earlier temperatures. No other country in the world, no other G20 country in the world has as ambitious pledges compared to its own use of and emissions of GHG gases, which take it on the 2-degree path. Yes, we are well on track to meet it.
The challenge in the Paris targets is that we've been so severely hit by COVID. I mean, so many of our resources have gone just to fight COVID in different ways at different levels. So we might find that challenging, but I mean, there is a chance that we'll meet it. There's a high chance. So I'm not a pessimist, I'm an optimist about the Paris targets, but I believe that the Paris targets alone might not be enough for our country.
India is one of the most climate vulnerable nations on the planet. A land of varying topography and climatic zones, it routinely suffers from extreme heat and drought, to severe rains and floods. According to the Global Climate Risk Index, it ranked among the top 10 affected countries in 2018. To reduce the risks, India has taken major steps to deal with the natural disaster it routinely faces. For example, the government has built dams, barrages, levees, and embankments to control the flow of water. But experts believe such measures are of limited use, since a river in Spate easily breaches such fortifications.
One of the things that we have learned over the years, not only as far as floods are concerned, but in many, many areas, you need to live with nature, not control nature. Many cities in the world have tried to control rivers and floods by building embankments, by channeling rivers through, but whenever there is an excess flow and excess flow happens, then it overflows into the city. This is as much true of cities in France and Germany as it is of cities in India. On the other hand, making cities such that they can take in the larger amount of water and slowly release it, the so-called sponge city, is an alternative which allows us to live with nature rather than fight nature.
The entire approach till now has been to build dikes and embankments, to somehow, it's the same approach of conquering nature, that I am going to find a way that I will hold the river down, because the river must not flow against my wishes. So it's a very masculine approach towards river management, but it has failed. And what we are not realizing is that we are not going to be able to succeed, to be able to conquer nature, to be able to control the river. We should be finding ways of being able to let the river water provide the bounty that it can without the destruction.
The government would require to mitigate and adapt to climate change if we really want to address these floods, because we are always going to have these freak weather events now. So first of all, I think we really have to put the environment on priority. Currently we think of it as a nuisance that's coming in the way of building a highway, but we have to change that, and we have to understand that this is our barrier. So I think we need a complete shift in perspectives.
The mindset is changing. There are greater awareness and commitment today to find a sustainable development path. But the change is not quick enough to make any difference to the lives of people such as farmer Khalilur Rahman in Assam or porter Abdul Wahab in Bihar. When flood water rises, all they can do is to watch as it destroys everything that they hold dear right before their eyes. No one has come to their rescue, especially now when the government is too preoccupied with the challenge of containing the spread of the pandemic, which has ravaged the lives of so many of its residents.
পয়সা করি থাকলে না ওখানে যা মাটি কিনলাম এই সোদা যা হারে ই করলাম যে আর পানি টানি যাতে না পায় আমাদের তার তা নাই পয়সা করি থাকলে আমরা ফাঁকে ফর্দে যা মাটি আঁকমু তা তো নাই কুমুক জমা আমাদের চরের মধ্যেই পড়ে মারা নেব তাছাড়া আর কোনো যাহাম না সরকারের দিবে পালি তো সব কিছু করে হবো আসলে দেবো না যা বাড়ি ঘর ক্ষতি খেত খোলা ক্ষতি ধরেন ছাগল ইনা ক্ষতি হইলো গরু বাছুর ক্ষতি হইলো ইনার যদি অনুদান সরকারে দেয় তাহলে সে আঙ্গুর আল্লাহ হইলো নি তার তো সরকারে আঙ্গুর দেবো না আমরা হইলাম কৃষক মানুষ আবাদ করে খাই যা আর কী করা যাবো আঙ্গুর একটু করে খাই নেব
और जब भूख के लिए चिल्लाता है तो उसे कहता हूँ कि 1 घूंट पानी, वही में से पानी पिला देता हूँ साहब, क्या बताऊँ इस सलाब में। कल सब डूब जाता है, सब डूब जाता है। भविष्य में क्या कि ये तो हम तो अपने नज़र से देख रहे हैं, तो मेरे बाल बच्चे की ज़िंदगी में अब तो ये तो बुझा रहा है गड्ढा बन जाएगा साहब। हम लोग तो बिल्कुल बेबस है साहब।
Climate change threatens to push hundreds of millions into poverty, increasing their vulnerability to climate impacts. It has already led global temperatures to rise about 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But it's often the poor and the most vulnerable who have had to take the brunt of nature's fury. The path India chooses to achieve a sustainable future will impact not only the country but the whole world as well. Can India chart a new course for a poor nation that's struggling to deal with the challenges of climate change and achieve a higher growth rate? Despite the uncertainties and risks, many believe the country can still do much more to make this planet a better place to live in future.
I don't think India can ever deal with it on its own. I think, whether it's COVID, whether it's climate change, we need global cooperation. And I think one of the biggest lessons that we have learned today is that the world is not acting as one. The world is acting as separate. And that is why we are losing the battle on COVID, and we are certainly losing the battle on climate change.
And climate change is reminding us very firmly that we are doing this, is the ultimate adventure of all times. It's called intergenerational climate. It's called the adventure that we are embarking on now is intergenerational colonization. We will not be remembered well by our children and their children. And this is not a matter of ethics. This is a matter of pure survival.